I take it everyone here may have heard of George Crockett in some way, shape, or form. So I want to take a moment, as Peter and I are trying to think of the best way to present him, was to actually go to read a passage from the introduction of the book that really captures the entire book, the decades of his career, and it includes really a compendium of various statements he has made between 1971 and I think 1991 about episodes in his career and his life. And when you read the book, after you read the book, come back and read the introduction, and you will see just how compelling those statements were about his career, his view of his career, and the effect of things on him. But let me read for just a moment this introduction of George Crockett. And it goes like this. We live in a time when virtually everyone has an opinion. And I should note that these statements were made 30 years ago. And when you hear them, think about where we are today. All right? We live in a time when virtually everyone has an opinion, but few have deeply held principles. Even among the principled, not many have the courage to take serious risks in support of their convictions. This is not always the case. This has not always been the case. There was a time, not long ago, when giants walked in our midst. George W. Crockett Jr. was one such giant. Two key principles drove Crockett's life. First, he was unshakable. He was an unshakable commitment to racial justice, what we call today an unapologetic anti-racist agenda. The second, paradoxically, was a belief in the power of law and the Constitution. This was not the Constitution revered and applied by white judges. It was the latent power of a Constitution that only black judges and other judges of color could see, understand, and wield. It was the United States' real but unrealized Constitution. Crockett's own words are the best means to introduce him to a new generation. And this is what he says. Racism pervades every area and facet of American life. It is characteristic of American life, and hence it is characteristic of American law. To deny that racism exists throughout our judicial system is to be oblivious to the fundamental truths about the 20th century America. We can say the 21st century America. Racism has been an integral part of American law since the first Negro slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. A new nation, which bore witness to the world in 1776 that all men are created equal, experienced neither logical nor moral difficulty when 11 years later it adopted a constitution that sanctioned human slavery and decreed that a person held in bondage should be counted as 3/5 a person. Racism is evident in our courts whenever and wherever a black litigant is involved. It is indigenous to the law as applied to blacks, whether the proceeding is in Michigan or Mississippi, in federal or state tribunal, or in a court of civil or criminal jurisdiction. There is no equal justice for black people today. There never was, never has been. To our everlasting shame, the quality of justice in America has always been and is now directly related to the color of one's skin as well as the size of one's pocketbook. The reasonable doubt that is usually interposed to save the life and liberty of a white person charged with a crime seldom has any force or effect when a colored person is accused of a crime. How do you change the mores of the police officer on the street or the sergeant at the precinct station who believes that black people have no rights that white people are bound to respect? How do you change the thinking of a black nationalist whose despair has turned into a bitter hatred of all white people? Although the Constitution was written 2 centuries ago, It has no life or meaning for Black Americans until the people breathe life into it by living it. And that has been the struggle of the 20th century. We live in a multiracial, unjust world. Its problems cannot be corrected by men who don't understand what it is to grow up powerless and oppressed. Until the status quo is changed to reflect and use the diversity as well as the knowledge we could have available to us, we won't solve anything. I refuse to allow myself to forget the fact that I am Black and a Black judge. Once I do that, I think I'm lost. That's the introductory remarks of George W. Crockett. Peter, how do you describe how a man becomes such an evangelist in the sense for the Constitution and civil rights, having made those conclusions about what he has experienced in his lifetime?
Yeah, a little paradoxical. First, I want to thank you for showing up tonight. I want to acknowledge Ed Littlejohn, lead author here, our professor emeritus, and co-author, and the person who started this project. But Crockett really was a paradox of somebody who actually believed the law could make a difference. Right? And that's what differentiated him from some of the Black nationalists that he crossed paths with. And it is paradoxical, because he also knew the injustice that surrounded him, which is why it was important for him to say it wasn't just law that could make a difference. It was a particular understanding of the law. And it was understanding of the law that could only be wielded by people who understood oppression. Right? And so he was a huge advocate for Black lawyers early in his career, because only Black lawyers could make the difference that needed to be made. And later on, a huge advocate for Black judges. But it goes back even to his high school days. So when he was in high school, there was a speech competition that was to talk about the post-emancipation amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And he was about advocating that back then. So I mean, even coming out of high school, he had a firm of appreciation and understanding of the radical potential that the Constitution could have if properly interpreted. Right? And he carried that with him his whole life, despite the fact that there were many times when the law failed him, right, and many times when the law was failing.
Well, I'm glad you touched on that point, because that high school experience seems to be kind of like the scene from Citizen Kane, Rosebud. It was that for all old movie buffs. But that high school experience germinated and stayed with him for the rest of his days, did it not?
Yeah, but it sort of also, there were multiple lessons in that.
Yes.
I mean, first off, the fact that he could even go to high school in the South was amazing. I mean,
because he was originally from Florida.
Right, so Jacksonville, Florida. There were no more than 24 high schools for Blacks in the southern states. Right? So just sort of imagine all the obstacles that are coming through. So he was living in a city that had a high school. It was named Stanton High School under the Civil War Secretary of War, Stanton. And he was originally told he couldn't be part of the speech competition, that they had already selected who would represent the school in this sort of intramural competition. And he goes home and talks to his mother, who was a huge influence on him. And his mother says, as long as there's a course of appeal, the decision is not final. Right? So she persuaded him. Yeah, great mothering, right, is behind all great men. But so he goes to his principal and says there should be a competition, it's not fair. And his principal agreed. So they had an in-school competition. He won the in-school competition. He then went to the inter-school competition. He won the inter-school competition, and the prize then was $200, right? Which might not sound that significant today, but that $200 enabled him to go to Morehouse College and start his college career. Right? So all sorts of very interesting things coming out of arguing about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
And so because we have, there's so many things we can touch on, but he goes from Morehouse College to the University of Michigan, and which is another interesting story by itself. And he has an experience at the University of Michigan upon graduation that also affected him. Can you touch on that as well?
Yeah. So I mean, first, there's discrimination everywhere.
Right.
I mean, so he's navigating this world, and one just other insight is he is the product of black culture and black community and black support, right? And that was true in Jacksonville, in segregated spaces, right? So I mean, segregation is nothing to praise, but it did create enclaves of empowerment, and it did create enclaves where people could get the support that they needed to be successful. He didn't have that at the University of Michigan, right? So he shows up in Ann Arbor with no support systems, with being the only black person in the class, having to wait tables to make his way through. But when he graduates, he's talking to the dean of the law school, and they're looking at whether or not he could go into teaching, right? And the only school that the white dean could imagine that he could be a teacher at was Howard, right? Which is a great law school. I don't want to downplay that. But this notion of completely racialized, there's no way this person could have given him the job. There's no way that he was going to give him a job. But he did write him a letter, right? And the dean at that time at Howard was Charles Hamilton Houston, so writes him, and he gets a letter back saying, "Well, thank you very much for recommending Mr. Crockett to us, but we just filled the position," and the person they had filled it with was Bill Hasty,
right.
And those who kind of know the sort of legendary black judges and black lawyers. Bill Hasty was certainly one of those of his time.
Absolutely.
And pretty soon after started a lifelong friendship between Crockett and Hasty.
Now, he wound up taking various positions, but ultimately ended up in Detroit in the 1940s. And can you touch on what brings him here? He ends up here in Detroit working for the UAW at the suggestion of a friend, and that catapults him to a whole nother level.
Yeah, so he gets into labor. So he becomes the first black lawyer at the Department of Labor. Rises up to be one of the top black lawyers in the Roosevelt administration, and then goes to the Fair Employment Practices Commission as the equivalent today of an ALJ. Right. Then gets into the UAW at a very senior level to fight discrimination inside the union. Right? So you sort of see this sort of role of economic justice, of labor justice, labor rights being there. And comes to Detroit in 1943, shortly after the race riots here, meets Murray Sugar, who becomes what he calls his father in the law, and meets Ernie Goodman, who would become his partner in law. But this is at the time when Ruther is purging the UAW, and he's part of the team that is deemed too liberal, too red, too closely associated with the Communist Party. And so all three of those lawyers, who are arguably the three best lawyers that Detroit has ever had, are thrown out on their ears, and in the shadow of a boycott, right? So it wasn't just you don't have this job.
And there was also the point that Ruther had cut a deal supposedly with Crockett that he reneged on.
Yeah, right? So I mean, Crockett was a man of principle, right? And Ruther arguably had less principles.
Right.
But it was all about the GM strike, right? So they negotiate with one, then they get to negotiate with the others, and Crockett was demanding that each of these contracts would have non-discrimination provisions in them. And Ruther, who was in charge of relations of the UAW and General Motors, told Crockett that he would do that, he would demand that. And then he caved, right? So the GM contract that year, in contrast to the other two big three, didn't have an anti-discrimination provision, and basically at that point, Crockett and Ruther split, and Crockett would not have anything to do with it.
And so he got gleaned, wiped out of the UAW, so to speak, and then somebody comes to him about an idea of a trial that's coming up in New York.
It's all the Sugar connection.
So the Sugar connection.
He's out of the UAW in 1949. Sugar, Goodman, and Crockett and some other lawyers are practicing not as a law firm, but as kind of a loose confederation surrounded Murray Sugar. Murray Sugar is going through all sorts of problems, just disillusioned, right? And so he's in New York, kind of on a hiatus, where he is working with the team of lawyers that are representing the Communist Party officials, United States versus Dennis, who are being charged under the Smith Act for criminal charges, for basically what they thought. I mean, this is sort of the low point of the First Amendment, where very clear that they are being criminally charged for what they were thinking and what they were saying, not for what they were doing. And it was very important for